So how's everyone doing today? Good. Good? Nice. At least we have some nice weather. Record-breaking for October from what I've heard. So I'm honored to be here today. I've had the pleasure of working with David Swizzler and Austin Smith from Ogletree. So I can say your last name.
Nicely
That's
done.
cool.
That's right through it.
Ogletree Deakins. There we go. I know that they are a very well-known name and respected entity in our community. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to them to talk about our FLSA.
So we're here to talk about something we think is really fear, loathing, and something awful, the Fair Labor Standards Act. And before we started, I was talking to a couple folks here. The number of cases, and we'll touch on this, getting filed, if you guys haven't had one, is really astonishing. There were 4 yesterday filed in Denver alone, by the way. So we see the reports, all in the energy industry. All 4 of those, I think, were. And there was one as an outlier in the retail. So certain industries seem to get hit at different times. But a little bit about us in the Denver office. I'm the managing shareholder of the Denver office. David's one of our attorneys in the office too. We cover everything from workplace violence to wage and hour class actions, advice and counseling. I spend a lot of time in the wage and hour class action world, so hopefully we do not get the opportunity to work together on a case, but can work together in some advice to try and avoid the case, or if a case gets filed, make it a whole lot easier to make it go away. That's our goal. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes unfortunately not. But we're here to talk to you a little bit about both the current state of the law, exemptions, white collar exemptions, and a little bit about what's coming, because what's coming truly is a little bit scary. So we'll do a brief history lesson, a couple of basic exemptions, some tests to talk about how to test whether someone's properly classified, a little bit of enforcement, some proposed changes, and then what we suggest you do in light of some of the changes that are coming. So starting off with a little history lesson, most employment laws are very, very old, very old. Just to give you an idea, the Fair Labor Standards Act came out when Superman was released the first time, right? A new home was about $3,900. Average wages, $1,730. Cost of a gallon of gas, 10 cents. Country was in the middle of the Great Depression, and I like adding this in just because the website I found some of this on said it. A telephone with a built-in ringer was a luxury and was quite cutting edge. But I say that just so you understand the nature and the language of the act itself has basically not changed at all. With the exception of the addition of the computer professionals exemption, it's pretty much exactly how it read back then. The regulations have changed, but the law itself has not. We are dealing generally with very antiquated laws, and in some cases, very antiquated decisions interpreting those laws. Here's a little scale of the minimum wage for those who haven't nerded out on it as recently as we have. So
I'll own that.
Yeah, I mean, you can see where it starts out at 25 cents. You can't even buy a postage stamp for that now. And then creeps up to $7.25. And you guys, if you also nerd out on politics like I do, see that there's all sorts of people wanting to make it $15 an hour and in some cases higher, which bears no resemblance to any economic statistic, but it sounds good and would have a drastic impact. Now, you can tell there's various times where the minimum wage hasn't caught up and then made some big swings, but it's been at $7.25 nationally, by the way. You guys know we have a separate minimum wage in Colorado, but nationally for quite some time. And today, we're not going to hit on Colorado's specific wage an hour, but for most of these exemptions, the tests are the same. And if you want to test our knowledge and try us, you can hit us up and see if you can trip us up on something that's specific to Colorado. But most of what we're going to talk about is federal in nature. Now, we're talking about exempt employees today, right? Exempt versus non-exempt. Non-exempt folks get paid overtime. Exempt people, by and large, do not, unless you want to, and just be nice to them, which would be kind of awesome if we got overtime, actually. The brief history of the salary basis, we're going to talk about what that means. But to qualify for one of the white-collar exemptions, you guys probably know you got to at least pay people a certain base amount. That number is now $455. It started out at $30. Pay them $30 a week, they could have been exempt under the various white-collar exemptions. Now it's $455, and it's been $455 for much longer than the minimum wage has been set, over 10 years. So that takes us to, when we're looking at whether an employee is exempt, we're looking at 3 things. What's the level? What's the salary level? Does the person make enough money to even be exempt? And frankly, that's not a test that ever really matters, because 455 is low. In very, very, very rare instances, am I having to ask an employer, are you paying them $455 a week, right? So are you paying them enough? Do you pay them on a salary basis, which we'll spend some time talking about, meaning you're not paying them by the hour, you're actually paying them a salary and not having illegal deductions from that salary, right? And many of you have probably asked the question before, can we deduct if the person doesn't come in on Friday, or we have this or that? Well, if a person performs work in that work week, they get paid for the work week, right? Are we paying this person as a salaried employee? And finally, the primary duty test. Is this person performing the primary duties of whatever exemption we're trying to make fit? If it's an administrative professional, if it's a manager, are we talking about a learned professional, which you can tell the act was in 1938, because I can't think of a single human who would classify themselves as a learned professional today, right? You introduce, I am an engineer, well, I am a learned professional, or what that means. So 3 tests. Are you paid enough? Are you paid on a salary basis? And do you do the right kinds of job tasks? That's what we're talking about when we're looking through the exempt statuses.
So we'll go through some of the specific exemptions, and my expectation, or my understanding, is you probably already have a pretty good sense of what this is, but we want to make sure that we're not overlooking something that you may have missed. So there are a few categories of primary exemptions that everybody thinks about. And I'll be candid, there's probably another 40 exemptions that very few people think about unless you're in a specific industry. So if you're in agriculture, you probably have a sense of the classification of employees who are also exempt from overtime. If you run an amusement park, you look at the list of exemptions outside of these basic ones and you just wonder who had the best lobby, because they carved out their industry to protect their wages. And we're not going to go into all the exemptions because that would be much longer than a 1-hour presentation. First one that most of us think about, obviously, is the executive employee exemption. And you're going to look there at what their primary duties are, and are they managing the enterprise or a subdivision of it? Do they usually direct at least 2 or more full-time employees? And they have to have some indicia of that executive authority. Are they hiring and firing? Do they have that ability to direct the workforce, change status, give increases, or effectively do so? Where we see a lot of employers trip up here is that managing 2 employees, or they are given a title of manager of, and manager of a service is different than managing individuals, right? You might have a manager of marketing, and that's their responsibility, but there's nobody under them. You might have a manager of sales, but they are the salesperson. So you have to ignore the title in this context and really look at the duties they're performing and the individuals over whom they have responsibility to guarantee that they're meeting that primary duty function that they're actually considering. Administrative exemption, this is what I would say is probably the least favored exemption by the Department of Labor, so it's the one they give the most scrutiny to. So if you're classifying an employee exempt under this specific category, you want to make sure that you're pretty comfortable that it meets all of the requirements, because the DOL looks at this with a jaded eye. And what are they looking for? Primary duties, obviously it has to be non-manual work. They have to be related to the management of the business or of the employer's customers. They have to have independent judgment with regard to matters of significance. And that's where things get a little squirrely, is how much control does this person actually have on a day-to-day basis over things that matter? You know, if they're following a routine process, if there's a manual that says, here's your flow chart on making a decision, that is not going to be considered discretion and independent judgment. So you have to look at what's driving the decisions and how much authority they have to actually make that decision before you can adequately and accurately classify them exempt under the administrative professional exemption. So I would just be cautious with this one as you go through all of the elements. Professional employees, here we go back to the learned professionals and all those engineers who are using that title. Basically, what level of experience do they have and how did they gain that? For the learned professional exemption, the presumption is that it was some kind of advanced education through the schooling that allowed them to earn some kind of accreditation or certification or degree before they qualify for the learned professional examples. Now, that's a really broad brush. There are other individuals who don't have to have a degree who actually qualify for this. But you want to look at what level of expertise do they have, how did they get it, and is that separating them from the rest of the workforce? There's also the creative professionals work. So these are the ones, the artists, the people who, it may not be a field of education that got them there, but it really is how much independence and creativity do they use to move your project forward. So learned professional, you're looking at both education and then that creative ability. Skilled computer employees, this one is the one that's been added, obviously, since 1938. Didn't have this, as far as I know. This one's pretty specific to how much do they control or direct control of your systems. If you have somebody who's just managing the system that you've provided to them, they may not meet this exemption. If they're truly crafting your system or deciding what needs to be included in your system for the business to operate most effectively, that's what I would look at with regard to the computer employee exemption. So this one's a little unique, but they're not looking for the lower level employee who's working within a system. It's the outside the system or driving your decisions with regard to how to best manage the business. Outside sales employees. These are the guys who used to be pounding the pavement and selling encyclopedias. How much time are they spending outside of your workforce generating sales? A lot of people get confused around this. So somebody's working from home. Are they outside sales? The answer is no. It's truly away from whatever their domiciled work location is and hitting the pavement and trying to drum up new business. So the phone doesn't work, the computer doesn't work. This is somebody who is away from a location before they meet this exemption. Now, how much do they need to be away? That's still some level of shades of gray.
Customarily.
Right. So for those of you who can define customarily and put a percentage on it, that's great. The DOL and the courts haven't gotten there, but it's how does it feel? I mean, unfortunately for most of us, many of these assessments end up with a non-concrete answer. It's based upon everything that I know about this position, whether they're executive, whether they're administrative, whether they're computer, whether they're outside sales. It's in aggregate, does this feel more like an exempt level position or does it not? Which makes giving advice and counsel on it pretty hard. Right? Because if you end up in that gray area, how aggressive do you want to be with the interpretation and how much risk are you willing to take on in classifying somebody as exempt? Because the safest category you can ever take, obviously, is non-exempt, right? If you're paying them hourly and they're getting overtime, the Department of Labor generally doesn't care. It's when you take them out of that protective status and create that exemption is where you're going to get more heavily scrutinized. Also within the outside sales group, there's this group of employees where things get somewhat confused, and it's drivers who sell. So there are people who are outside of the workforce, and are they selling your product or are they really just servicing your customer? And on the drivers who sell dynamic, if they're really just, maybe they're stocking beer, right? So you've got a beer distributor and they're there and they're just making sure the shelves are full, that's not selling. But if they're showing up at the bars, at the liquor stores, and then negotiating space on shelves, negotiating quantity. So if it is that give and take to make the sale, drivers who sell are going to qualify as the outside sales exemption. If they're really primarily just servicing a client and doing the day-to-day functions, these individuals probably don't fall under the exemption of outside sales. And by the way, guys, if you have any questions, if we're going too fast, if I'm going too slow, if I'm making no sense, which could happen, feel free to interrupt, raise your hand, ask a question, and we'll make sure that we can answer your question to the best of our ability.
Still stuck in the 35-hour work week. I'll be wrestling with that all day. Before we go into lawsuits, which are near and dear to my heart and particularly riveting, there's a couple things on the topics David just mentioned. Don't forget that people can and should be analyzed under more than one, right? We talked about the manager earlier, who's the manager of marketing, who supervises no one. Not going to qualify as exempt under management duties, probably is administratively exempt though. Right? If the marketing manager is making decisions as to where the marketing campaign is going to go and where dollars are spent and whatnot, this person could be administratively exempt. Could even be exempt under learned professionals. Right? The person could have this could be a job that we're requiring a high-level marketing degree or something. So same thing with computer professionals. How many of you have help desk employees? We have computer help desk employees. Yeah, almost certainly not exempt under the computer professionals exemption, right? The reason, and then skilled computers, the reason is they're not designing and developing anything. They're working through, is your internet plugged? Actually, here's what they're working through. Have you turned it off and back on? Right? Doesn't require a lot of discretion and independent judgment as to matters. Well, it might be matters of significance, depends on what you're doing at the time, right? But a help desk employee or the people who are helping people get onboarded, almost certainly not exempt. Is it at least under that? Is it possible that they're administratively exempt? Maybe. But as David said earlier, I guarantee you that's the bucket that you're going to get sued on the most is the administrative exemption. These are assistant managers, frontline managers, things like that.
The converse of that, and we see this periodically, is we have an employee who is truly a learned individual, so they have a PhD, but if they're not applying it in the capacity that you've hired them for, it doesn't matter. You could have as many doctorates as you want and be flipping burgers. You are not now an exempt burger flipper. But I mean, you need to be aware of that. Just because someone is highly qualified, if you're not using them for those qualifications, the exemption does not apply.
It's difficult because the way my burger's flipped is a matter
He's
of significance.
good though. It might be actually.
It's a significant matter. And
I think it's creative,
judgment.
professional.
It should
I mean,
be
you
creative.
might meet that.
I actually worked on a case for a brief moment. This is kind of funny. I think it's funny, where the employer had classified exotic dancers under the creative professional exemption. Got sued. Then called them all independent contractors.
Got sued.
Got sued again, right? It's like, by God, man, at some point they're employees. Let's just call it what it is. You have other problems. We should not be focused on this one. And they did end up with other problems. So yeah, I mean, that's one, is we want to make sure people are looking through. It's almost like a decision tree, right? It's not as if, oh, well, the person's not really managing more than one person, so clearly not exempt. May very well fall into one of these others, or vice versa. Another exemption that I'll throw out there that is often not used and can be is the 7I exemption. Anybody here gone through a 7I test? 7 with a parentheses and a little I in it. That's for commissioned employees. And since we're sitting in a banquet room, I'll use as an example. A lot of hospitality can use it or do use it with banquet employees where you're charging big service charges and then that amount is getting split amongst the people who work the banquets. You see 7I a lot. When we have commissioned employees or employees who could be earning something off of a commission or a charge, a lot of sales types environments, they may not qualify as outside sales, but it's an overtime exemption, not a minimum wage exemption, right? And there's some qualifications that go onto that. More than half their pay has to be from commissions, has to be more than 1.5 times the minimum wage, and so on. But you can actually get a lot of folks into various exemptions.
How many people here work in the retail industry? So that would be one that you definitely want to be aware of.
Yeah, if people can upsell, if they can get if they get some piece of a commission of any kind from something, or even if it's a shared commission or a charge, but that's how they're paid. In other words, it fluctuates up and down. You can use a 7I exemption and exempt people from overtime. So there's different ways. These are the basic ones, but like David said, there's movie theaters. Movie theaters have an exemption. So maybe you can call yourself movie theater and show a late night showing.
Put them in a car, call it a taxi.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are exempt as well.
So anyway, there's a little bit more than what we've just discussed. FLSA lawsuits. This is a great stat for people like me, not so much for people like you. And so as we look at the years, they kind of flattened out a little while in the 2010 to 13, 14. This year, the first half of the year, we have almost as many as we had. It's not up there now, but in the whole year of 2009 nationwide. These are FLSA lawsuits and all. These are federal lawsuits, so it doesn't actually track every state claim. But in the federal database, when a lawsuit's filed, they check a box and qualify. So it's easy to track this kind of number. But if this holds true, I
mean, we're on track to hit somewhere near 10,000, 11,000 FLSA lawsuits in 1 year alone. That's a lot. And how many of those? At least 60% are class cases, guaranteed. Very few individual wage and hour cases out there.
Every plaintiff's attorney is fishing for a wage and hour case. If somebody comes in with a discrimination case or they just don't like the way they were treated, a plaintiff's attorney is going to have a sympathetic ear towards that, and then they talk about how you were paid. Because with all FLSA, fear loathing, cases, attorney's fees attach. So, and if they can find one that you've paid wrong, there's typically a class full of them, and it's now created higher dollars.
Anybody know how much they have to recover on behalf of their client to recover all of their attorney's fees? Anybody know what that threshold is? Literally something more than zero. That's it, right? So if you've mispaid an employee and the employee should have been paid $5 of overtime for the one shift because they came in for orientation, we realized they smelled bad and we fired them. And so they recover $5 and the attorney's fees are $150,000 through trial. They'll get $150,000 and $1. Their client will get $1 and they'll get $150,000. They actually, because their fee agreement, may get some portion of the dollar. So they may get
30 cents.
They may get $150,000 and 30 cents or so. Or whatever that portion is. So that's it. That's why they troll for the cases. All they have to do is prove you messed up once, recover that on behalf of their employee and get all their fees. What they'll actually do is then shake you down to get it quicker, and get a much lower amount of money, but to move on to some other case. And shakedown's probably a rude word to use, but
No, it's not.
I'm fine with it. Yeah,
Right.
I'm cool with it. So why are we here? I mean, we just did a sort of quick recap on exemptions in a nutshell. This has been a sticking point. This is something that President Obama has mentioned for years and years and years, and now is going to do it. The comments are out, and he has wanted to, in his words, modernize and streamline overtime exemptions. Why? If you look at David has the comments here. Some of them make me chuckle, but the comments from the agency itself, from the Department of Labor, they believe that more people should be paid overtime. Okay, and they want more people to receive overtime. And so one way to do it is to essentially wipe out a class of people who currently qualify as exempt and move them into the non-exempt bucket. That's what they think will happen, right? And so here's some of it. Update the existing protections. That's what they want to do. Address the, quote, changing nature of the workplace. Well, that's changed since 1938, I'll grant you that. And simplify the regulations, and to that I say, paha. I've yet to see any administration simplify a regulation of any kind. And here's their quote. Today, the Department of Labor has announced a proposed rule that would extend overtime protections to nearly 5 million white-collar workers within the first year of its implementation. I think 5 million is grossly underestimating because they didn't want it to sound too drastic.
I think they're coming up currently with numbers around 40 million to 23 million, somewhere in that range, who are going to be immediately impacted.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good, so 5 million is a little more palatable. So we'll stick that in. I want to work for a government agency because then you can just say things. It's like the weatherman. You can just say them, right? It doesn't have to be true, and no one's going to call you on it.
You do at some point have to be right.
Right, at some point you do. October 31. This is going back last year from the actual administrator's enforcement. Now, one of the former administrators works at our firm, so it's always, we picked him up after he left, so it's always good to get his insight on this. But his insight was colorful, and I can't repeat it. But targeting investigations in industries where they're most likely to be cheated out of their wages, right? That was the word used. That's not our word, but their word is that the workers are being cheated. That sounds objective. Taking strategic enforcement to the next level, right? If any of you, I won't ask you to raise hands, but any of you have been through a DOL audit probably are not real interested in whatever that next level supposedly means. Although my least favorite person, our local DOL, is gone now. She got promoted. Great success. Make our investigation of one employer resonate throughout the particular sector. I'm sure a lot of you want to be the one who makes it resonate. That sounds nice. Increasing the cost of non-compliance, including civil monetary penalties, liquidated damages, and debarments. Now, debarments mean no more government contracts, right? Civil monetary penalties, I will say this, anybody been through the process where you're going through civil monetary penalties or anything like that? It's somewhat public, so I don't feel too bad asking. In this division now, where we are, they will not tell you what that is. I don't know if you've had one of these recently, but in the last couple of years, here's how the audit goes. You determine, and we go through the audit and we agree. Look, there's some people that were mispaid. We probably owe some folks 20 grand, let's call it.
and we're going to pay those people their 20 grand back. In the old days, that would be good enough. Old days meaning like more than 4 or 5 years ago, like really old. Still phones that look like this, right? That was it. You would pay them and move on. Or if there was some penalty to be attached, you would negotiate it with the Department of Labor at that point. Look, we'll pay this and we'll also do some training or whatever. Now what you get to do is pay that $20,000, not have them tell you if there's going to be a civil money penalty and how much, and then find out later. What does that sound like? Well, for one of our clients, it meant paying the $20,000, feeling like everything was done, and then about 2 months later, getting hit with a $95,000 civil money penalty. Had they known that, okay, we would not have paid the $20,000. We would have fought it anyway to fight the penalty, and then ended up in a lawsuit fighting the DOL over the $95,000 anyway, regardless, because they weren't going to pay it. And that's how you end up. So that's what this process looks like. What the next level looks like, I have no idea. No one's really defined that for us. So filing a complaint, it is somewhat of a fun little process if you go through. It is easier to find on the DOL Wage Hour Division's website how to file a complaint than to look up the regulations for what qualifies as an administratively exempt employee. Try it sometime. Much easier to file the complaint than to figure out if you're in compliance. Also, if you guys, they have handy little apps for people to record their hours. If you've gone through that, very easy for them to record it. They consider, by the way, they consider, not the courts. So I want to clarify, this is all the DOL. They consider whatever employees to have put in those apps essentially true. I mean, that's, so if the employee says clocked in, but there happens, they will take that and say, no, the employee says, because they used our app. Okay, thanks for that. You know, it must be true. Yeah. You know, it's like, yeah, whatever's on Craigslist, I'm sure is an accurate representation. Craigslist, an accurate representation of the item.
Well, if it's on the internet, it's got to be true.
It always is.
Yes, sir.
Always is. So, Department of Labor Enforcement, 23% increase in initiated investigations over 5 years, 20% in establishments found in violation, and violations found in 78% of agency-initiated investigations. Okay, so when you've heard attorneys and people from that were in the DOL talking to you over the last 5 years saying it's getting worse, it is. I mean, it's demonstrably worse for employers. 78%. I mean, if you get an investigation, you are much more likely than not to be hit with something, and then we're worried about the whole civil money penalty thing, right? So when you talk to outside counsel and your outside counsel says something like me, and I usually say the faster we get these people out of here, the better. Okay, and if that means giving them something and giving them some documents and saying, look, you're right, everything was right, but yeah, we mispaid this person, so here's some money and leave, that's why. The faster I can get them out, the better off you are. It is not in our best interest to sort of screw around with this for the next 6 months in a long drawn-out audit to prove we're right, which I hear all the time. Well, you have a 22% chance that you're going to prove something's right, roughly speaking. So that takes us into what are these supposed regulations and why do we say that they're not so great?
So following President Obama's kind of directive, the Department of Labor, pursuant to that, said, okay, we'll take action and go wherever you want us to go. They published, if those of you who are looking for some light reading, in the Federal Register.
Show them the font if they're looking for
so
light
it's
reading.
3 columns of, I think it's an 8 font, not including the footnotes that are a smaller font. So if you're looking to put some eye strain on or you're bored and need to sleep, great bit of reading. So they published this, and then in response to that, they're obligated to allow the public to comment on what they've said. And they had a public comment period that closed September 4th. They had over 290,000 comments on these proposed changes. And the comments come from all sides of the table, whether it's from employees directly, management, labor organizations, the government itself. I mean, everybody can weigh in on whether they like the proposals or don't like the proposals. And then what's supposed to happen is the government's then supposed to look at all of those 290,000 comments and then modify the proposed regulations consistent with the proposals or the comments that they receive from the public if they find those comments to have merit. Now, unfortunately, periodically, the government says, thank you for your input, and we just disagree. So we appreciate you took the time. We'll include it here to acknowledge that you did say something, but we're going to continue forward with the direction that we've chosen. When this comes to conclusion and when the government publishes its final version of the regulations, we don't know yet. So we're still waiting on that, the preparation of the final rule. It'll have to go through a budget review process, and then they'll publish the final rule, and this basically tells you this is what you will now be subjected to. That's the process. So there's a lot of people out here who are saying, well, this will never go through. The public won't allow it. Congress won't allow it. Somebody is going to intervene. That train has left the station. The only way that this gets challenged now, really or realistically, is somebody looks at the comments in their total and says the government didn't actually engage their diligence in considering those comments in the final rule, and so challenges the administrative process that the government engaged in. The likelihood of that, I think, is relatively small. I don't know.
Very small.
That was really close. If you couldn't see the gap, there was a gap, but it was small. So that's where we're going, and this is kind of the process the DOL has engaged in. What are they really talking about? They are talking about increasing salary levels. I mean, I think we've all heard that, and we'll go through the numbers in a second. You've got the weekly salary level. We haven't touched on the highly compensated employees. Right now, for highly compensated employees, if they're making $100,000 a year and perform at least one of the functions of an executive, administrative, or professional, they can also qualify as an exempt level employee. They're rewriting that dollar threshold. And they're also looking at what are the primary duties. So all of those things that we've talked about with regard to the different classifications, and trying to determine if those are properly crafted. So as much as everybody's targeting the wage changes and the salary basis changes, there's this lingering potential that they could significantly impact those categories of individuals who might otherwise currently fall into that exempt level classification. So what are we talking about with regard to some of the dollars? You currently are obligated to pay at least $455 a week, roughly $23,000 annually. Well, by the way, that's going to more than double to $921 per week. And that's just for 2016. By the time this actually rolls out and becomes effective, they think that that's going to be more than the $921 threshold. Probably closer to $970 per week guaranteed minimum salary. They're going to benchmark these numbers off of government data at the 40th percentile according to their own statistics. So what this does for us is, if you look at those incremental charts that we put up at the beginning, where it shows from $30 a week guaranteed to $455 with kind of gaps where it jumps, those gaps now go away and it's benchmarked. There will be an incrementally increasing number on what that salary basis is. So consider that a guaranteed wage increase for your exempt level employees. Whether you are going to give them an increase or not, the government's going to say if you don't, they now become hourly, and you're obligated to track those hours and pay them overtime. So it's a built-in system that now does away with this periodic review and what seems to be a periodic arbitrary increase.
Do you guys see what that's going to, practically speaking, do, right? I mean, just from 1 year, it's roughly, well, I guess 3 years, 2013 data, so from 47 to 50, effectively that means to be exempt, you're going to be paying somebody $55,000 to $60,000 to feel good about it, right? You're not going to pay them, you're not going to say, oh, well, if it's $50,500, we're okay, because you're going to be in the same boat the next year. So since this benchmarks, what it's really going to realistically do to those of us making these classification decisions is tell you, well, probably want to be in that 55, 57 range, at least for the next, say, 5 years or so, to feel good about it. Because if you're hovering right in there, you're going to have people going in and out of exempt status every year.
And so let's also consider the possibility that the economy takes a downturn, right? And the data shows that 40th percentile has now been reduced. How many of you realistically are going to also reduce your borderline exempt employees consistent with that reduction in the economy? Congratulations, you now got a wage cut because the government's allowing me to do that. And although you may be legally allowed to do it, I think from a practical perspective, that's probably not going to happen.
You could reduce them to a 35-hour work week and then cut their pay.
Well, that's how they're defining full-time as 35 hours. So they're already there.
That's true.
I mean, so if you read the notes, it's a 35-hour individual is what's technically full-time according to the DOL.
Right.
So, may I ask a question for,
Yeah.
so for learned individuals who are expecting to make percentage X over less learned professionals who are not going to be salaried employees, is that going to have a ripple effect on industries like engineering and that kind of thing? Where
Yeah.
they'll say, well, if the bar is set at 40 or 54 or whatever,
Yeah.
shouldn't I be paid
Oh, yeah.
significantly more than that?
Yeah, so let's say you have, an entry-level engineer at an engineering shop who thinks, well, I got an engineering degree, I've got my master's in engineering, I may be young, but I'm not going in to make the same as whatever, right? Some other administratively exempt person in the shop. Yeah, I think that's absolutely going to have an effect. So now you're going to have starting pays or expectations for certain positions now that may be in the 60,000 range, expecting more like 75, 80. Because they're going to look around and say, well, these people who don't have a degree or whatever or aren't in this, they're already at 55, right? And so I think that you're absolutely going to see ripple effects, or some practically speaking, we'll talk about a little bit, the elimination of a lot of positions.
And from an HR perspective, think of the compression that you will suffer. Because if you've got people who are currently making exempt level, let's just say at $30,000 a year, and you need to bump them up to 50, there was probably somebody already sitting around that $50,000 slot who believed their value was $20,000 more than that employee that we're addressing. So do you allow everybody to now make $50,000 a year? Or do you then have that ripple effect up where it's a $20,000 increase on everybody above them because the relative internal equity has now been shifted? So as much as the DOL is talking about the individuals who may be impacted, they are not addressing that ripple effect and the roll-up within an organization on how compensation plans are actually created.
Well, and let's think about, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but let's think about the impact this has. We talked about, burger flippers earlier, kind of jokingly, but about some entry-level, properly classified exempt positions today, entry-level management positions. So frontline managers, people who really want to be managers, it's important to them for their career. If we're looking at $50,000, you're roughly talking about $25 an hour. If we talk about roughly a 2,000 hour year, right? Somebody takes a week or two vacation. Well, how many people realistically then are going to get that entry-level management job from a $12 an hour job to essentially $25 an hour job, right? So there's some reality that you just start thinking through this, and the reality is probably going to eliminate that level altogether. More than likely. That's what you're going to see is, well, we just won't do that. We'll put a little bit more burden on the next level up and expect more out of the next level manager who makes $65,000. We'll eliminate that one altogether. And since you're non-exempt, you just won't ever have that opportunity to be in that middle level.
If you just think about the individuals in their late teen years who may not have gone the college route, who really are going through industry looking for progression. And you have a lot of 19, 20-year-olds who become managers, but it's at that lower currently existing wage scale. Realistically, is that opportunity still going to be there? And I think the answer's got to be no.
Going from 35 to 50 is a big swing.
So what's the DOL considering? They also have to look at what is your compensation. And there was some pushback on, is it just your weekly wage? Is it that $920 a week guarantee? Or are we going to allow the employers to include some version of bonus or additional compensation to account for that guaranteed weekly salary? And the DOL is saying, yeah, we'll consider it. Maybe 10% of their income can be included in that calculation. But if we allow a 10% cushion, when does that get paid? A lot of employers, when they're doing this compensation structure, you might put it off quarterly. You may put it off to the end of the year to account for and adjust for how the year has gone, your profitability. The DOL is saying, well, that's probably too long. Maybe we'll give you a 4-week window to bring them into that guaranteed weekly income. And for those of you in payroll and those of you who are compensation experts, how realistic is that and how you would structure their compensation? If you're going to pay them the difference at the end of the month, More likely than not, so you don't have the heartache, are you just going to build it into their weekly salary anyway? So as much as it might sound like a cushion, from a practical perspective, I don't know many compensation experts who are saying that's the way we would recommend the system be structured. The other things that the DOL are considering is, nope, I include both of them, so there's nothing else.
Well, then that's it. No,
And now we're done. Thanks for coming. We talked briefly about the highly compensated employees. So those individuals making the $100,000 threshold who have other indicators of an exempt level position, that dollar figure is now jumping up to $122,000 at the front end. By the time this rolls out, probably $128,000. And this is, again, going to be benchmarked roughly around the 90th percentile of income earners. So we're seeing these individuals get a 22% raise immediately if you want to keep them in this category. Now, one of the things that they're looking at is what is customarily and regularly performing these exempt level functions. Is the dollar figure and the classification going to be enough, or are they going to reassess how often and how much they perform those functions? So we could see a significant change around the HCEs, the highly compensated employees, when this is finalized. Just me, is this you?
Either way.
Okay,
Go
just
ahead.
checking. Great. So
Rock, paper, scissors.
the DOL is really, they've talked about looking at the primary duties test. So this is going back to all of those exemptions that we talked about earlier, and are those adequately described in the current regulation, or are they willing to rewrite those, and are they considering changing where that threshold is? Because currently, if you are performing exempt level functions and meet the exemption, you're done. It's not a question of how much you actually do it. There's not a fixed percentage that says you must perform this function at least X amount of time to qualify for the exemption. That second bullet goes to some kind of what used to be called the long test, where they would weigh, well, here's your salary and here's your duties, and based upon the combination of the two, if your salary's high enough but your function is low here, do the math, okay, you meet the exemption. Or maybe you really performed a lot of exempt level functions, but your salary was down here. There was this, again, an amorphous feeling, did it meet the exempt test? They're talking about potentially going back to this long test of, let's weigh everything, compensation and function, to see if they meet an exempt level responsibility, rather than what I'll say is kind of more clean right now. It's, do you meet a duty? Do you have a base level salary? And that makes it relatively easier. You know, Austin talked about, are we simplifying the regulations? If they go this route of a long test, the determination is going to be much more complicated, which leaves you at more risk. So that's where we're going with regard to the potential changes on duty. They're talking about, again, no real quantitative definition currently. Do they go to an 80-20 example? Do they put a hard number on it? California currently has a hard number on how much responsibility and how often they have to perform those responsibilities, which is a 50% rule. The federal level doesn't have that, but we could see a number that says you have to perform exempt level functions X percentage of your time before you qualify.
Yep, I spend about half of the, well, maybe now about 40% of my wage and hour works out of California. And in some ways, the 50% rule is easy. You know, courts like it, they apply it. You just throw all the work somebody does in a bucket and see what comes out. But that's not the rule they're looking at. We keep saying proposed changes. I think the primary duty stuff is proposed. I think some of this other nebulous tasks-based stuff is, but just understanding the political landscape, it will happen. I mean, they didn't go through all this effort to not change the salary basis. If nothing else, those numbers will go up. And just from a practicality, they have to go up next year, or it'll never happen. And this is something that the president promised before his first term and didn't get around to it before the first election, re-election, because he didn't want to have any pushback from it politically, right? So now it has to happen. So it's one of these things that, you know, we see some employment law things come and go, and these are proposed laws or regulations. We know all of the number stuff is coming, right? So let's not consider that proposed, but all the primary duty stuff is a little more nebulous to us. That might or might not actually occur.
So according to the DOL, if you're in the industries of it's manufacturing, or excuse me, business management and finance, 50% of the employees performing those functions will probably be affected by the proposed regulations. If you are a learned professional, they say roughly 32% of those employees will be affected by these regulations. So if you are highly staffed with management, finance, or learned professionals, there's the expectation that you will be significantly impacted by these changes. If you're in sales, they say probably only 10% of the industry, the executive, administrative, and learned professional employees will actually be exempted. But if you could be in one of those target markets that are going to have a higher percentage of impact relative to maybe other industries.
So a couple opportunities. There's something that the DOL is right about when they say 78% of people that they audit have some sort of issue. It's sort of a challenge I've said before, and to a lot of clients. If you give me a stack of payroll documents, I'll find a problem. Okay, and we know the plaintiff's lawyers will too. It's just too hard to make sure that every classification's right, that we're calculating regular rate of pay correctly, that we're accounting for commissions in the right way. And then when you stack some of the Colorado specific laws on top of that, it gets hard. So most have some group of employees that either have some wage issue or are potentially misclassified, especially in the administrative context, right? It's too hard. We make these determinations, we classify folks as exempt or non-exempt, and then 5 years later, we act as if those same exact classifications for all the same exact jobs work, and they don't, right? Because the exemptions, while they sound good from an overall classification standpoint, all they need is one employee that says, I was hired into this class, but I don't really do this stuff. My day-to-day activities, I don't exercise my own discretion. Amazing how important people are when they work for you, and then when they leave, they're like, nope, never did anything important. Never exercised discretion, never worked on anything that mattered. No one really cared. I sat in the basement with a stapler. That was my job.
And everybody is happy until they're not, right? I mean, everybody likes the structure and we're comfortable with the compensation until we're not. And then it changes. And the self-reflection and how they describe their own function significantly is redrafted.
Yeah, and then it's a very wishy-washy sort of place to find yourself arguing over exemptions. But it's a very hard thing to do to reclassify employees. Why? Because once reclassified as non-exempt, they assume that, well, I must have been mispaid for the last 5 years, and now I want to complain about it. So if there's any silver lining, and I really am struggling to even call it that, because there's almost nothing good to talk about the horrifically depressing stuff we've already discussed. If there's a silver lining, it is an opportunity to reclassify people who are on the border and blame the government, which is always great, right? And so if we already have people that you've been thinking over the last 3 years of going to seminars like this, and every time leaving thinking, we've got some problems, and never have done anything about it, there is an opportunity, perhaps over the next 12 months, to do that in the auspices of, well, we always classified you correctly, but because of changes that just took place, now we have to reclassify you as non-exempt, and perhaps get some of that suspicion away from that we've done something wrong. Right? So when the government changes things that impact it, sometimes I'm like, maybe we can use this as a sales pitch to try and make some changes and move on and get away from that statute of limitations. Really struggle to call that a silver lining, but it's something we can consider.
He's a glasses half full kind of guy.
Today. Only Maggie brought up the glass that's now more than half full. So when we do these and we're doing internal audits, there's no magic to them, right? What kind of documents should be pulled, but they should be thorough. A wage and hour audit can't be, I've pulled the payroll records for a machine operator and an admin in marketing, right? That's not an audit. But we want to look at a cross-sampling across the entire organization. So I look at our non-exempts when I do take the opportunity, do a wall-to-wall. Let's look at our non-exempts. Let's make sure we're calculating regular rate of pay correctly. Let's look at our classifications, especially borderline ones like administratively exempt folks, and highly compensated people, by the way. That's a borderline classification because it doesn't require you to meet all of the duties of any one, just some. And so we want to look at those and make sure they're actually performing them. And who's going to do it? I'm not a believer that you have to have outside counsel or even in-house counsel or attorneys do all of your wage and hour audits. But if you even remotely think there are some potential issues or there's something to uncover, consider trying to get it protected by the attorney-client privilege. Why? If you find a problem and basically don't fix it immediately, like right that second, it's evidence of willful conduct, and when you get hit, then you'll pay twice, liquidated damages on everything. And so, because all the memos and the emails saying, hey, I think we've misclassified our admins, all is discoverable because it's not privileged. And once they find one of those emails, then the judge is going to find that you acted willfully in not fixing it right away. You'll have no good faith defense. And then instead of paying $100,000, you'll pay $200,000.
Well,
or
and you
instead
also-
of paying $1 million, you pay $2 million.
You change the look-back period because the
Yep.
standard case is a 2-year look-back period, but if they can discover willful, now tack a year onto it because it's 3 years.
Right. So you go from 2 to 3 and you get to double it. So all that's awesome. And so, I'm not saying that because you need to involve attorneys, but I do think there's sometimes if you think that's coming, or if you scratch the surface of an audit and start to get a funky smell, pretty good idea to try and get some of that protected by the privilege so it's not disclosed. Right, and then we can actually come up with a plan to try and fix this and keep all of that protected so it doesn't get produced. Job descriptions. I love job descriptions most of the time. They provide good evidence for us. They're great in the audit context because I get to sit down with an employee and say, tell me what you really do. Just tell me what you do in a day. And then I get to look at the job description and go, so you don't do this job then because none of that's here, right? And so job descriptions are important. They should be accurate. They should be drafted to fit the job people actually perform and not the job that the managers want to hire for, right? And they need to reflect that. They're not determinative at all. No court has ever said, based on this job description, this person's exempt. They find them persuasive. They say this shows the intent of the employer, but what the employee actually does day to day is what's going to drive whether they fall under an exemption or not. So we like them. They're good evidence. They help guide us in an investigation. But it's not going to win or lose the case. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's not going to win the case. It absolutely could lose a case for us. So what are we doing when we're doing these what-if analyses? And we lay it out here, and it's a lot, so it's kind of a small font, although not as small as that. If you want to know what if under these new regs, I might pick a number higher than 50,000. I might pick, 52, 53,000, and then just kind of run through what happens. What would happen if we had to reclassify these people as non-exempt? And here's why, and David and I talked about this before. Here's what I hear from business folks. Oh, they can't be non-exempt. This is absolutely going to bankrupt us. Well, that's not very creative, right? I mean, if you give me a position and how much money you want to pay that person, assuming it crosses this threshold, I guarantee you we can work it out where it's revenue neutral. All right, it may end up having some early pain. The employee thinks they make $50,000 a year, and now you're telling them they make $14 an hour or something, but it can get to the same place, usually. If we're realistic about how many hours this employee normally works in a year and what the pay range needs to be, reclassifying people doesn't have to cost more money because of overtime. But psychologically, it hurts, right? I thought I was a manager. I thought I made $55,000, and now you're telling me I make $20 an hour, and I'm not a manager anymore. Well, you can call them whatever you want. You can call them manager or vice president, but to reclassify it, it's a point of pride to some people. But when I hear we can't afford to do this, we can't move people to non-exempt, my response is always, well, it's a very pessimistic, non-creative way of looking at it, because all we have to do is play with the numbers a little bit, and we can get them there. But it's worth doing a what-if analysis. Yeah. So that if you have people who are under, pick a threshold, but it should be north of 50,000, who you're calling exempt, they're under that and you're calling them exempt, it's worth taking a look at it to see if this is going to cost you more money.
But realistically, and you have to think about those employees who really get their self-worth from the title or from the fact that they're salaried, right? I don't have to punch a clock. I mean, I don't know that that was truly considered in any of this, because there are a number of individuals who are going to lose both of those things, which now the personal value has changed. So at some level, that becomes your responsibility as HR on how to sell it and how to convince them their value is not diminished by the change now driven by the government.
Exactly. Let's go ahead and bounce to the next.
Next one.
So some options, we can reclassify, and we've basically been talking about that. You can move them to hourly plus overtime. You can reduce their salary. You can have salaried non-exempt employees. A lot of you probably do. right? I mean, our assistants are salaried non-exempt employees, you know, paralegals in our law firm, they're non-exempt employees. They're paid based on a salary and they expect it. There's middle ground there. There's non-exempt people who we pay a salary to and do not make deductions necessarily if they come in, you know, an hour late or decide to stay an hour late that night and sort of work their schedule. That's harder to do if you have a massive workforce in that classification. It's not so hard to do though if you don't have a lot. Say, look, we're going to pay you $40,000 a year. That's what we're going to pay you, and we'll pay you overtime. They are entitled to it if they work it, but then you're offering them some flexibility in their week, right? It doesn't mean you have to say you're non-exempt, so I need to see a time card, right? I need to see you, you know, clunk, clunk, punching into the machine. We can give them flexibility if we want to. We just have to make sure we're paying them overtime. That's what it means. And so we play with the numbers to make sure that we're getting there. Fluctuating work week, man, there's a bunch of sort of nerdy things we can do to sort of change the work week around and make sure it fits without overpaying in the overtime world.
With regard to the fluctuating work week, though, if you're going to go that route, get counsel. It's a complicated process, or it can be, and there's a lot of ways to mess it up. Just because you want to fluctuate their work week doesn't necessarily give you the right to engage the fluctuating work week process. So that one just scares me for most employers because I think I've seen one person do it right.
So if you just say our work week fluctuates, that's not enough?
It's not really,
Okay.
no.
All right. It'd be kind of cool. So obviously you could raise some salaries, you could restructure the workforce. That is going to happen. I mean, there's no question that you're going to see that happen, right? Employers innovate. And so when you see something that looks like it's not going to be revenue neutral, we expect there to be a squeeze. We expect there to be a squeeze in frontline managers. It will happen. Same thing if you hear, you know, things like a $13 or $15 minimum wage. Well, we know who that hurts. It's easy to say that it helps people. It hurts people looking for a first job. How many places are going to hire a 16-year-old to work at, you know, Chick-fil-A anymore if they have to pay him $15 an hour? No one. Really, I mean, they're not going to. It hurts people in certain industries, so we know that employers will automate or innovate or shrink a workforce. And with the exemptions, the way we believe, and I bet money on it, a lot of money probably, if anybody wants to take the bet, that we will see that band of employees in that lower level management shrink, because it's much easier to move those duties up, eliminate the position, and keep people in non-exempt spots. So we will see workforces resize. And sort of retool may be the best way to say it. How do you handle bonuses? David, you covered that. And remember, we still have to comply with state wage and hour laws. So this affects federal, but in many states, Colorado included, we have a whole other layer if you're covered by the Colorado minimum wage order, and then we got to make sure those things sort of mash up and work well together.
You know, and the interesting part about trying to be revenue neutral, that's understandably one of your goals. When this was published, the Federal Register, the government has no expectation that this will be revenue neutral for you. The most recent number that I've seen said that this should cost employers roughly $1.6 billion in the first year. I think those are real numbers. I think this is going to be significantly expensive, not just learning the process and understanding the regs, but the cost impact is going to be significant. Yes, sir?
Having to pay people more, does that take into account like the administrative changes and implementation costs and, you know, getting up to speed with the clients?
So the question was that number I threw out just, I think, the wage increase, and the number that I saw was not just wage increase. It was the administrative cost, it was the understanding and the implementation, plus the wages. I think they said about 500 million of that was the administrative side of this issue.
Is that number like the 5 million people will be affected, or it's just sort of probably going to be a lot higher?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a safe estimate. I'm just telling the numbers that they're saying, and my guess is they shoot low.
Yeah, I mean, it's grossly unpopular if they said, well, 10 billion, so it's easier to say 1.6. But I think that's right. Can you make it revenue neutral? You can. Will people? They hope not, and most won't, right? And so they'll get stung or something will move around. But they're not doing this so that we'll do that. The entire intention is to move people into overtime and then have them be paid for it. I mean, it's not just to move the exemption so that, you know, HR folks and their attorneys can get together and figure out ways to make sure it's revenue neutral, which I'm telling you, in most cases you can. That is not the stated purpose, though,
of these changes.
No, if you actually read this wonderful document, and it's politically charged language, but I'll use their language, they're talking about taking wages from the employer and giving the money to employees. They use the taking language freely and throughout.
And cheating.
Well,
Like we
there's
used
the
in
cheating.
books, yeah. So they're positive. This is what they're saying is positive. So a static response, right? We won't do anything, therefore people will get more overtime, and which is true. If we do nothing and we don't change classifications, then more people will be entitled to overtime. Additional 5 million employees, that's their number, and some employees receive increases to get them to 40th percentile, which is true. Some people will get bumps if that gets them into that 40th percentile range, probably if they're close. My guess is people who have frontline managers making $32,000 to $35,000 or something will not get a bump. They'll just be reclassified. But if you're in the 40s, probably going to have some people get a bump because we're not going to want the potential overtime burden. If we keep them where they are, if someone makes $40 an hour or $40,000, sorry, then they make roughly $20 an hour. Moving them now to non-exempt where their overtime hours are at $30 an hour is just not going to make sense. And so there are probably quite a few who will get a swing.
So one of the other potential consequences of this, and this is me being as positive as I ever am about this law, is if you look at when the FLSA was initially passed in '38, one of the stated intents was to put people back to work, to get more people into the workforce because there's a disincentive for employers to continue to work a single individual beyond 40 hours a week. So we'll keep them at 40 hours. You have to hire more people because you're not paying overtime. There's the possibility that this could be one of those areas where the law is looking at and the government is looking at saying, we have a huge population of unemployed individuals or disenfranchised individuals who've removed themselves from the workforce. So maybe by creating this new pain point for employers, it takes people out of that unemployed, underemployed, disenfranchised workforce and puts them back into the stream. I mean, that's me giving them the best possible spin that I can, but that's the potential, right? If you've got to now pay more people overtime, you're going to cut their wages and maybe hire more.
I mean, these are the consequences we've been discussing throughout. I mean, it's all things that are somewhat foreseeable, but overall, it's gonna be a big swing. And the primary duty stuff's really interesting to me, only because we've had sort of an established set of cases, assuming the current status of what it takes to be an exempt employee. So once they tweak that really kind of screws up everything, because then you're going to be looking at case law to say, okay, well, I have employee X, that's like this industry's employee X, let me go pull some cases that look like it. Well, if we really change the nature of the primary duties test,
Start over.
we don't really have anything to go on until you build up 5 to 10 years of case law on it, right? And so the math stuff is relatively easy. Do you qualify, do you not? Do you have a salary level or don't you? Do people get overtime, do they not get overtime? But when we start talking about what the tasks are, that's where it's going to be really interesting and frankly, confusing, right? Because we're going to be trying to guess at what the courts are going to do with that. Fun stuff. Everybody excited? Pumped up? Yeah. Good way to tweak the system a little bit. It happens, right? Every once in a while you get these new little things that happen. This is just going to be a big one, and it's going to be an expensive one, I think, for a lot of people.
Well, and it creates some interesting disconnects between the potential workforce issues that we're seeing from the federal government, right? Because right now the federal government also has independent contractors square within its crosshairs, and they're attacking every one of those relationships that we have. The potential is we could see an increase in contingent workforce because you're not going to have as many employees. You're going to outsource that function. But what is the government going to do, because it's already challenging your ability to outsource and create independent contractor relationships? So we could see a pretty significant clash between the two stated incentives of where the government is going and where that resolves itself. I don't know. Do you have any?
No, sounds like good stuff.
Gives us opportunity. Thank
Yeah.
you.
That lawsuit number just goes up.
Right.
Well, if you guys have questions, we're here. If you don't want to ask them in a group, we'll hang out, and if you want to cloak them in a "I have a friend who," I'll still know it's you, and so will everyone else. But it might make you feel better that you're not outing yourself.
We have a question.
Yeah.
So assuming this passes sometime next year,
Mhm.
how much time do you think they're going to give us to implement it?
The following year, probably. I mean, it's hard to say, but it's usually June or January of the next cycle, whatever that is.
They have the ability to do a relatively short window and rollout. I mean, I think I think they can go as short as 60 days. I'd have to double check that, so don't quote me on it, although I'm on film, so now I'm quoted. Realistically, I just think from a political perspective, they'll have to give more notice because these dollars are just too big to say, oh, by the way, in 60 days, double.
The push, I'll tell you, the push is June, right? I mean, the last time I heard this politically, it's June, so that it's at least in place 6 months, out of the fear that if a president of a different mindset comes in the same month, that it would become effective, they would just wipe it out.
So you're thinking they'll want it implemented by June of 2016?
Usually. That's why you want these things, if you're the president, you want all these things in place with enough time to where it becomes normal, so that wiping it out is not quite as palatable. If you set it up to become effective towards the end of next year or beginning of January, it's too easy for the next president to say, well, that's all dumb, and I'm just not going to do it, right? And then everybody will sit on it. If it's effective January 1 and somebody else gets sworn in 3 weeks later, it's likely dead. So practically speaking, they're going to want it with 6 to 8 months of the current administration. That's what I would look at.
Yes, ma'am.
So, kind of from what you said, don't start changing things now. I mean, really take a look, and if you got blinding things, of course, we need to resolve that. But if we have some things that are maybe in the gray area, keep an eye open and wait until we actually have to make a change.
That's what I would do. I would, exactly as you stated it, I would look now at the positions that could be potentially impacted so that you're not surprised and scrambling when it comes in place. If you've got people that are potentially in that gray area, I would analyze it, think about what changes you can make, and then you're ready to go. And you can make those changes at or around the same time the government makes its changes. I'm not sure now's the time I'd run around to the workforce and say, hey, guess what? There's changes coming and people could get paid more money. But I also wouldn't want to just sit on it because this is not, I don't view the salary levels as, you remember many years ago you had the Employee Free Choice Act, and we were all going to be unionized, and the Teamsters were going to run everything, and it never happened. I don't view this as that. This is not a sort of scare tactic. The salary level is coming, and so I would look at that as, okay, well, maybe I add this to my fourth quarter of 2015 or first quarter 2016 to-do list so that you're ahead of it.
If you know you're wrong, you still might be able to make the change now and blame the impending changes.
Correct.
Say, we're going to be conservative, we're doing this in advance, and this is why. You could at least have a justification that may at least be swallowed by the affected workforce. Like, okay, I get it, things are changing, and you're just doing it in advance.
Especially if your pay raises and all that happens at the end of the year. Right. Yeah.
How firm do you think the $50,000 level is? I mean, that's over a 50% increase. Or has there been any talk about a graduated increase over?
There's been a lot of talk about it. There has been a lot of talk about a graduated increase and very little interest by the current Secretary of Labor. Look, I made note that he's aggressive, right? I mean, well, I should say wage hour division.
The entire division. So
the division itself, and I said Secretary, but I'm really focused on the division, is extremely aggressive in this. They were floating through the various professors and consultants. They were floating numbers way higher than this before, right? With the idea that we'll kind of look like we're compromising. But I think that's pretty firm. I would expect it to be in that 45 to low 50s range.
If you look at
they are putting it on the 40th percentiles. I mean, that's where it's going to come from.
If you look at the writings of David Wheel, who's one of the senior administrators, he's pretty aggressive on his approach to how he thinks management needs to change and how the workforce needs to be improved.
Before he was appointed yet, I mean, you can look at all this. There are articles, I mean, they're trying to shift from what they believe overcompensation to executives and bonuses at the top and find a way to take that money and redistribute it. That's what's in this very
Take
thick
is the
thing.
words they use.
Right, so take it from this pool. How can we get it to these people? One way is to increase the people that are eligible for overtime, and others to impact the minimum wage.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk just a little bit more about help desk people that, and the classification?
Did I make it sound like I didn't think that they worked enough with them turning it on and off the computer?
So the question was, can we restate some of the issues around help
Yeah.
desks and the exemptions?
Yes.
Absolutely. And just to be clear, I do have a fairly low opinion of our help desk sometimes. So I just want to, because I have gotten such bad service.
Be nice.
But they're not here. And they've heard that comment from me, so that wouldn't surprise them. Whether there's 4 options under the skilled computer professionals. All of them, though, are around people who actually design and implement something. So give you an example. Who would likely be exempt? The person who comes in and says, this is the payroll system we need to implement, and we're going to integrate it into these computers, and this is the interface, and is actually designing what that looks like, right? Who else might be when we're talking about hardware? The person who says, well, what the attorneys at Ogletree need is a computer that has this type of software on it, and it plays well with these devices and all that. Who is not? The person who actually just comes and sets up the computer, plugs it in, and answers my basic questions about this is how you log on, these are the systems you need to use to get you access to these, we're going to get you these passwords. None of that requires that person to be exercising design and implementation types of decisions. That person is going to be non-exempt. To be exempt under the computer world, you have to be making some sort of decision. I'm grossly oversimplifying, but decisions about the design, the process, or whatever. So it's almost, it's generally what you call your IT management functions, more than what in the corporate world would be the day-to-day IT people. It applies to more than that when you get to like graphic design companies, and so if you have that, you may have a lot of people who qualify because they're actually designing and creating interfaces and things. But to most corporate settings, your IT management folks who are deciding that you can use the iPhone but not this, which is always very infuriating to people. Why is my phone not approved? Or the people who are deciding, we're going to use mobile iron because blah blah blah, or this, that's what we're looking for. Unless the people walking you through the phone tree as to how to make sure your internet's hooked up properly at home.
For your help desk employees, I would look at whether or not there's some kind of decision tree or manual that walks them through to the result needed. So if they are, okay, if A then B, and well, if B then if you can move through a process to get to the solution, more likely than not, they are not exempt.
Where it gets hazy, and I've had a couple of these too, is the person walks through and then they say, David, I see the problem. Your problem is the router you're using to get to this, and this is not, adequate. And so I'm going to order you this equipment. Well, now it starts to sound more exempt-like because they're exercising a little more discretion into the design of the system that you're using. That's kind of the in-between. And then the question with that, when you hear that, is, well, how often are they doing that?
We're getting the shepherd's hook.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Yeah.
Get them off.
Yeah.